Tov, good evening, everyone. We are in the Zera Shimshon, taking a look at another piece on the Haggadah, and this is Os Hey, section 5. In the sefer itself, it is on Daf Taf Reish Dalid. The whole section, the Zera Shimshon's whole section on the Haggadah, can be found after Parshas Bo, and in his parish on Chumash, and we're going to start right now. We're going to jump right in. V'hi she'amda lavosenu v'lonu shelo echad bilvad omar aleinu l'chalosenu ela shebachol dor vador omdim aleinu l'chalosenu v'hakodesh baruch hu matzilenu miyadam. This, of course, is a very famous line, a very famous piece from the Haggadah, and it translates as follows: and it has stood for our forefathers and for us. We'll talk about what the it is in a moment, but it has stood for our forefathers and for us, that it wasn't only one time that they came to destroy us, but in every generation they stand up against us to destroy us, and HaKadosh Baruch Shem. So the it is actually identified in the previous paragraph in the Haggadah. It's the Haftacha, it's the promise that Hashem made to Avraham Avinu, to the patriarch Abraham at the Bris Bein HaBesar, at a special, it's called the Covenant of the Pieces, a special covenantal promise that Hashem made, that Abraham's descendants would be exiled to a land, a foreign land, and they would be enslaved there, and they would be there, but they would ultimately leave that place with great wealth. So the promise that has stood by us is that even though we will suffer exile and suffer oppression, we'll come out of that experience, and even come out of that experience with compensation. So the Zera Shimshon says, Hiksha hazevach Pesach. In the sefer Zevach Pesach, it asks the following question: even though it is true that our forefathers in Egypt the forefathers in Egypt were in fact rescued from Egypt because of the promise that Hashem made in the Bris Bein HaBesarim to Avram Avinu. As it said a little bit before in the Baruch Shomer Havtachos Yisrael, blessed is Hashem who observed and kept his promise that he had made to Avram Avinu regarding taking Bnei Yisrael out of slavery, v'chule, etc. Eich ka'amar hacha. It's true that the promise did result in us being freed from slavery in Egypt. How can it say here in the Haggadah, "De osa havtacha amdalavosenu velonu"? Does it say that promise applies to our forefathers and to? How does the promise that Hashem made to Avram and this covenant apply to us in any way? De eich yitzuar, how is it possible? She bishvil havtachas bein habesarim, that because of the promise Hashem made during this bein habesarim, Asher Kfarnis Kaima B'Yetzias Mitzrayim, which was already fulfilled all those years ago, millennia ago, when the Jews left Egypt. Anachnu Nitzolim Hayom Hazeh. We are still being protected and rescued from that promise. The question that's being asked, Zera Shimshon is quoting from another sefer, Zevach Pesach. The question is, why do we say in the Haggadah that God's promise to Abraham is still protecting us and still applies to us? When if you read the Bris Bein HaBesarim, it seems to refer specifically to the experience of the Jews in Egypt, and that was already fulfilled. The Jews, in fact, did go down to Egypt. They were in a foreign land. They were subjugated, and then Hashem took them out of great wealth. So the question is, that whole promise to Avraham Avinu in the Bris Bein HaBesarim has happened already. That's old, so to speak. That's been done. That promise was fulfilled. So how does it apply now? As the Haggadah says, even in our generation, that same promise is protecting us and it applies to us. So the Zera Shimshon wants to answer. That's his first question that he brings, and he wants to answer it in the next paragraph. Didan lo kasha. According to our view, this is not a problem klal at all. This is no because at the experience of the bris bein habesarim, lo hakadosh baruch hu Avraham, Hashem showed to Av kol ha'arba malchios, all four of the powers of the kingdoms that would ultimately exile the Jews, where the Jews would be exiled throughout Jewish history. To Moshe Amru b'Medrash, as they Chazal say in the Medrash Rabbah, V'hine ema chashecha v'chulei. The Medrash Rabbah quotes the pasuk quotes one of the psukim from the bris bein habesarim, and it says here we don't have the whole pasuk; it's just an excerpt. But the pasuk that the Zera Shimshon is referring to says, "V'hine ema chashecha gedola nofeles alav," and behold, a fear of darkness which was great, a great fear of darkness. A mighty fear of darkness fell upon Avraham Avinu. That's a pasuk from, or a piece of a pasuk from Bris Bein HaBesarim. So the Medrash comments on that. Ema, when it says fear, Zu Bavel. This is a reference to the Babylonian exile, to the kingdom of Bavel, where the Jews would exile. Chashecha, when it says darkness, Zo Madai. This refers to the kingdom of Media, where the Jews would be enslaved and exiled as well. V'chule, etc. Just to tell you how it continues, the word gedol in the pasuk, the Medrash says zu yavan. This refers to the Greek power that who exiled the Jews. Nofeles alav, and the last two words that this had fallen. Fear had fallen on Avraham, so the Medrash says Zo Esav. This refers to Esav, the last of the Golios, the last of the four periods of exile, and that's the one that we still live in today. The situation of exile, of diaspora that the Jews are in, spread all around the world, and still yearning for the thing of the third Beis HaMikdash. Our exile now is still called Golos Esav, the exile of Esav. So all four of the great exiles of the Jewish people we're communicated to Avraham Avinu at the bris bein habesarim. The in Canaan, if so, bevadai sheba'osa havtacha shevtiach la'Avraham latzilenu, then the promise that Hashem gave during bris bein habesarim to save the Jewish people, shaycha l'chol hageulos. This is applicable to all of the four redemptions from exile. So the Zera Shimshon deals very clearly with the first question. Again, the first question from the sefer Zevach Pesach was, how does the promise, how can the Haggadah promise of the bris bein habesarim Abraham applies now? If you read it, it looks like it only applies to the experience of the Jews in Egypt. And so he answers the Medrash Rabbah. No, the Medrash Rabbah says that actually during the bris bein habesarim, Hashem communicated to Avram not just that his descendants, not just that his great-grandchildren would be enslaved, his great-grandchildren would be enslaved in Egypt, but also that they would experience Golios. All four of the Golios of the exiles of Jewish history were told to him by Hashem, and therefore Hashem's promise at that time to rescue the Jews from exile applied to all of the future exiles. Fine. Now the Zera Shimshon continues, and he's going to pose two questions of his own. Omnam, however, b'derech acher novo l'dayek divrei hamagid. On a whole different path, we have questions to ask about the author of the Haggadah, what it says in the Haggadah. Shelo echad bilvad omar al. The statement that we read to start this piece said, not just one enemy has come against us, in every generation they rise up against, etc. And there's a question on this. What benefit is there to us? Meaning, what difference does it make to the Jewish people if one enemy rises against them or many enemies rise against them? Why is the Baal Haggadah, why is the Haggadah making a point about saying it's not just one enemy, it's many enemies? Why is that different to us? When Jews suffer anti-Semitism, or oppression or persecution, is it relevant to them whether or not it's coming from one source or multiple sources? V'adarabba, and just the opposite. It would appear that it would be better for the Jewish people if we had only one enemy, and that there should not be many enemies. The kavanas hamagid l'chori omar, and the apparent intention of the Haggadah is to say shebishvil tachaso lo rotza sheyeh echad bilvad, because of God's all the way to Avram Avinu, God did not want there to be just one enemy against us, Ela Rabbi, many enemies. So the Zera Shimshon's question here is, why is better? Why does the Haggadah statement that seems to indicate better for the Jewish people to have many enemies as opposed to one great enemy? Meaning, instead of, let's say, world's power, mighty world as our enemy, as it was in the time of Egypt, that was the great world power at the time. It's better for us to have many smaller nations oppress us or persecute us than it is to be oppressed by one great enemy. So the Zera Shimshon says, why is that true? It's better to have one enemy, because at least if you have one enemy, then none of the other, maybe you can always escape to other countries where you won't be persecuted. But if you have many enemies who are persecuted, it's true there might not be the greatest world power of the time, but why would it better to have the many, the one? That's his question. Ve'od, in another question, shehayulo l'sayim devarav ela sherabim omdim aleinu. The statement that we read from the Haggadah about Vihisha Amda should have concluded it's not just one enemy that rises against us, but many enemies have risen against us. But it doesn't say that. Ella va'amai siyem shebachol dor v'ador. Why does the piece conclude? And in every generation they rise against us. Ma inyan b'chol dor v'ador hacha. What is the relevance of saying in every generation to this comment that's being made in the Haggadah? So let's pause for a moment to understand this. Zera Shimshon's second question in this paragraph. So if the point of this statement of Vihisham is to say that Hashem's promise that he made to Avram Avinu in the Bris Bein HaBasarim is still protecting us, and it still applies to us, and it will ultimately be the thing, the Hashem's promise will be the reason that God redeems us, has redeemed us from other exiles, and will redeem us, God willing. It should be soon from the present exile. If that's what it's trying to tell us, and then it wants to add that Hashem, for our own benefit, we don't know the reason yet, but Hashem, for our own benefit, the benefit of the Jewish people, decided that we should have multiple enemies as opposed to one giant enemy. If that's what God decided, then the piece should have said, instead of one enemy rising against us, many enemies have risen against us. But it doesn't say that. It says instead of one enemy rising against us, in every generation enemies rise against us. Why does the Haggadah, the Zera Shimshon is asking, why does the Haggadah bring in this idea of every generation? We didn't seem to be talking about an issue of generations, what might have happened a long time ago, what might have happened in our generation. That doesn't seem to be what we were talking about. It doesn't seem to fit with what this little section of Vihisha Amda was saying. So those are his two questions. And he's going to begin to answer those questions now. Omnam, however, kfar hochachnu b'sedarim u'b'drushim hakodmim, we have already proven in previous commentaries and drushas on the parshios that have been discussed. The Zera Shimshon says, She'im hayu Yisrael misakvim b'Mitzrayim. If the Jewish people had been held in Egypt, ad tashlum ha'arba me'o shana, for the completion of the full 400 years that Hashem mentioned to Avram in the Bris Bein HaBasarim, instead of leaving Egypt after 210 years, as is what happened, if they had actually stayed another 190 years and fulfilled the full 400 years that God talked about the Jewish people spending, being enslaved in Egypt and spending time in Egypt, if that had been fulfilled, lo hayu mishtabdim od begolios acheros, then the Jews would never have experienced any future exiles. If we had fully fulfilled the 400-year period that God articulated at the Bris Bein Abisarim, then that would have fulfilled our entire time of exile for the whole history of the Jewish people. But that's not what happened. We left Egypt after 210 years, the Torah tells us, and therefore the Jews have been destined to have other future exiles. And as we said, we're still in exile today, the exile of Esav, the fourth and final exile. Ulefisha yatsu kodem zmanom, since we went out before the set time, huchruchu lachzor begolos, we have been compelled to return to Golos after the Golos of Egypt. V'go'olam misham b'chipazon, and Hashem redeemed the Jews from Egypt with rapidity. We were taken out of Egypt, as we know, with great speed. Lefisha kfar nichnesu b'memtes sharei tuma, because the Jews had reached a tremendous level, a low level in terms of impurity, and it's called the 49th level of Tuma. The im hayu nichnasim b'shar hanun, and if the Jews had stayed in Egypt any longer, then they would have reached the 50th level of impurity. They would have descended, so to speak, to the 50th level of impurity. Lo hayachas v'shalom od lahem tekuma. Then God forbid they may had never been able to rise out of that state. If they had reached the 50th and most deep, profound level of impurity of Tuma by staying in Egypt any longer, then it's possible we would have been lost as a nation and we would have been irredeemable. It would have been not possible for Hashem to take us out of Egypt any longer. So God, so to speak, had to take us out at that time. Because, and we have a question on this, She'im machmas tsar hagolos, if it was because of the pain and the suffering of the exile in Egypt, nichnesu b'memtes sharei tuma, that pushed the Jewish people to the 49th level of impurity, so then ultimately, af begolios acherim, even in future golios, efsher sheyavo lahem kach, it's possible that the suffering under future exiles would have led them back to the 49th level of Tuma, and God forbid, to the 50th level. And therefore, how was it effective for God to take us out of Egypt if we're going to, at that time, early, before the 400 years were up, how would that be effective if by doing so we had to suffer future Golios? Because maybe in the future Golios, the suffering would bring us right back to where we were in Egypt, to that 49th level of impurity, and then teetering on the edge of the 50th level of impurity of Tuma, God forbid. So how did it help? V'im tomar sheshar hagolios lo hayakol kach haruchim. And if you say it's because the future exiles that the Jews were going to experience were not so long. Shahari golus bava lo haya elashivim shana. For example, the Babylonian exile was only 70 years. V'halo golus zeh v'avonoseno harabim. The Zera Shimshon says you can't make that case because look at the exile we're in right now. It's Yoser Me'elef Tov Kuf Shana. It has already lasted more than 1,500 years. The Zera Shimshon, remember, lived in the 1700s. So he's saying, writing as a Jew in the 1700s, he's saying the present exile that we're in, again, the exile of Esav, has, since the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, has lasted more than 1,500 years, which was, of course, true at his time. Now, in our time, it's that many more centuries later. So therefore, you can't make the case that all of the Jews' future exiles would be short, in which case our question is, why did God hasten to take the Jews out of Egypt after 210 years if this would require them to undergo future golios, future exiles, and during which they might have descended, it's not just might, it would be probable, it would be likely that they would again, through the suffering and exile, go back to the 49th level of Tuma. V'yesh lomar, and we can say the Amrin beperek ches the Pesachim. There's a Gemara. It says in a Gemara in the 8th parak of Maseches Pesachim. This is quoting a pasuk from Shoftim. It's actually from the Shiras Devora, the song that Devora and Barak sang after their great victory over the enemy that's talked about in Sefer Shoftim, in the beginning of Sefer Shoftim, Parak Hey. So the pasuk says, Tzidkos Pirzono bi Yisrael. Translated in that simple pshat in Sefer Shoftim, this means that it was God's righteousness that delivered Bnei Yisrael from their enemies. So tzidkos pirzono b'Yisrael. Let us talk about, let us praise Hashem for the righteousness of His deliverance of Bnei Yisrael. So, but the Gemara views the pasuk, interprets the pasuk differently. Tzedakah asa hakadosh baruch hu im Yisrael. It was an act of tzedakah. It was an act of generosity that God did for Bnei Yisrael. Shepizran lebein ha'umos, when He spread them amongst the nations. So the Gemara in Pesachim takes the word pirzono, and it says it moves, it changes around the letters to equal shepizran, that God scattered the Jewish people amongst the nations. So according to this Gemara, it was a benefit. It was a benefit to the Jews when Hashem sent us into Galus, but not just into Galus, but to be scattered throughout the world, scattered throughout the nations of the world. This ultimately worked to the benefit of the Jewish people. Why? Because this put the enemies of the Jews in a situation where they didn't know how to attack us. Because if an enemy of the Jews wanted to destroy all of them, God forbid, let's imagine an enemy of the Jewish people says, I want to destroy all the Jews in the world, not just the Jews in my country, but Jews around the world. Like Hitler, Yamach Shemo, V'zichro. Leis Nehu Gabayhu. Because the Jews are spread around the world, they are not next to this enemy. They're not in the domain, in the country of this enemy, that such an enemy could possibly reach them. As much as Hitler tried, Yamach Shemo, to get his hands on all the Jews that he could, and as much as he tried to take over country after country and conquer country after country, thank God, there were many millions of Jews around the world who were out of his reach. And that's exactly what the Gemara in Pesachim is saying. God's plan was for Jews to be spread out around the world. So no enemy, no matter how devoted that enemy was to trying to eliminate, God forbid, the Jewish people, no enemy would be able to reach all the Jewish people. The Gemara continues, so let's say an enemy says, I can't reach all the Jews, so I'll just attack the Jews in my own country. I'll just kill the Jews, God forbid, in my own country. Then that country will be called an amputated country, meaning most enemies won't do that action of attacking just the Jews in their own country, because then people will say, look at you, you're attacking your own citizens. You're a cut-off country, meaning you're cutting off people from your own country. And that would be something that would bring derision upon them from the other nations of the world. And with this dilemma, the nations of the world, the enemies of the Jews of the world, get up in the morning and go to sleep at night, ad kan Lashono, until here's a quote from the Gemara. Very fascinating point the Gemara is making, again, that enemies of the Jews, according to the Gemara, are faced with the dilemma of, we want to kill all the Jews, God forbid, but we can't reach them. They're out of our reach. They're spread around the world. On the other hand, if we just attack the Jews in our own country, then it looks bad to the other nations of the world who's saying we're cutting off our own population. Now, we know that unfortunately and tragically, that cheshbon, that calculation of not wanting to attack the Jews in one's own country because you're attacking your own citizens, has not prevented through the years many countries from attacking their own citizens and the Jews in their own country. However, Baruch Hashem, they could only attack the Jews that they had access to, but not, as the Gemara says, Jews that were in other countries and far places far away. Ve'im kain, and if so, Shapir ka'amar hamagid shelo echad bilvad omar aleinu l'chalo seinu. From this Gemara in Pesachim, we understand what the Haggadah means when it says that it's good that we didn't have just one great world power enemy, but rather that we had multiple smaller enemies. Because if we had had another experience like Egypt, where the one great power in the world was our enemy and trying to destroy us, we would have been in great danger, because that actually could have happened. Omnam, however, Ata Shehem Rabim, now that Hashem arranged it so we have multiple enemies, Einam Yecholim Lamod Aleinu. They are not able to stand against all of us. They can attack, as we said, the Jews in their reach if they choose to do so in their own country, but they can't attack all of us. Vizehu, and this is what it means, Hi Sha'am Delavosenu Velonu, that the promise of Hashem by the Bris Bein Abasarim has stood for our forefathers and for us. Since during the other exiles the Jews were spread around the world, or at least in more than one country, the enemies of the Jews were not able to involve themselves with attacking all of the Jews, because at no point were all of the Jews in their reach. Which was not the case during the Egyptian exile. All of them were gathered together in one place. The Egyptians actually did have all of the Jews under their power, and that was an experience that God did not want to repeat. And so he did the chesed, the kindness to the Jewish people, again, according to this Gemara Pesachim, to spread them out around the world so that we would be out of the reach of our enemies. U'b'golos Bavel, and if you bring up the case of Golos Bavel and you say, but Bavel was a great world power at the time, Lo yeshvu ki'im shivim shana. That's why we were only there a short time. The Jews were only there for 70 years before returning to build the Bayis Sheni, the second Beis HaMikdash. And so that experience was kept short, so that the Babylonians, God forbid, never got into their minds to actually act on the idea of wiping out all of the Jews that were, in fact, under their power. So the Zera Shimshon has answered his own first question, which was, why did the Haggadah make it seem as if it's better for us not just to have one enemy, but to have multiple enemies, which seems counterintuitive. And he's answered that one enemy, which would be a great world power, God forbid, might have all the Jews in their reach and under their control, but multiple enemies, by being spread out and facing multiple enemies through our different exiles, has made it so that enemies might attack a portion of the Jewish people, but never have the ability to attack all the Jewish people. Now he's going to move on to his second question. In order to answer our question, the Zera Shimshon's question of why did the Haggadah talk about in every generation enemies have risen against us, instead of saying many enemies, many nations have risen against us? The reason for that is because sometimes an enemy can be harsher, can be more dangerous than another country. As the Gemara says in Meseches Gittin, here the Gemara is quoting Rabbah, the great Amora Rabbah, who said to Hashem, O bitulcha, O bitula de bar Esav. Rabbah said to Hashem, let us be under your shade, meaning under your protection and your dominance. Oh, Betula de Bar Esav. Or if we have to be exiled, if we have to be under a non-Jewish control, let it be from the descendants of Esav, which Chazal identify as Rome, as the power of Rome. So Rabbah at one point, and the reason he said this is because he was at the time experienced the incident the Gemara relates, is that he was experiencing anti-Semitism from Persian people, actually Persian priests, and so he says the Jewish people can't take being subjugated to these Persians. Let us be either Hashem just under your control, which would be the best, or if we have to be controlled by a non-Jewish nation, as we said, let it be under control of the Romans, of the Roman power. And the Gemara says that this statement seemed to be strange because Rabbah was in Bavel, and in Bavel the Jews were treated well. So the Gemara answers, well, they were treated well, but that was before the Persians came and took over Bavel. And when Rabbah made his complaint about the Persians, it was after the Persians came and started controlling things in Babel, and that's when things became very difficult and very bad for the Jews, v'chule, etc. Ve'eno nikar she'osim zeh b'sinosam osanu, and it wasn't even clear, recognizable that the Persians were oppressing or persecuting the Jews because of a specific hatred of the Jews. It would seem to be just that they were a very cruel people and a very harsh people, and it wasn't just based on a hatred of the Jews that they were treating the Jews badly. And it says further in that Gemara, it says, opposed to what Rabbah had said about Roman rule being more comfortable, the Gemara says at certain times God knew that the Roman domination of the Jews would itself be too severe and too painful for them to bear. And therefore God sent them to Babylonian exile, where, at least in the beginning, before the Persians came and conquered Babel, was a more comfortable place to be. So what the Zera Shimshon has shown us in this paragraph is that at different times, different nations persecute the Jews with more harshness than other nations. At one time, Hashem said a Roman being oppressed by the Romans is the worst situation, so the Jewish community will be exiled to Babel, which would be a better situation. Then the Persians came to Babel and started oppressing the Jews even worse than the Romans had done, which is what Rabbah was talking about in that Gemara, where he said, I'd rather be under Roman rule than under Persian rule. But the point is, different nations at different times persecuted the Jews with different levels of severity and different levels of harshness. Umishum hachi, and because of this, the Zera Shimshon continues, Nakat dafka b'chol dor v'dor. That's why the Haggadah spoke of every generation. Shelefi Maaseh Hador Afa Uma, according to the actions of a specific generation of Bnei Yisrael, of Jews, Afa Uma she'ena kol kach achzoris omedes aleinu l'chalosenu. Even a nation that normally is not so cruel might become very vicious enemies and try and destroy the Jews. So here the Zera Shimshon is telling us beginning to tell us a very important and novel idea, which is that we shouldn't have in our mind the idea that all the different nations of the world are going to act a certain way in a very predictable way throughout our different generations. No, depending on how the Jews themselves act in different generations, this might bring out the harsher actions from a certain non-Jewish nation than we would even have expected. And he's going to explain that now. The Amrino, as the Gemara in Yevamah says, Ein Puranos Bala Olam Ela Bishvil Yisrael. Suffering does not come to the world except if it's connected in some way to the Jewish people. When suffering comes to the world, to the whole world, to many parts of the world, the Jews should never say, "Oh, that has nothing to do with us. Look, it's not Jews who are suffering, God forbid, or even it's not Jews alone who are suffering. All around the world, there's suffering." So the Gemara says, no, we Jews should never view things that way. If there's suffering in the world, in some way it's connected to the fact that the Jewish people aren't acting in accord with God's wishes and living the lives that they should be living. The Ode and another Gemara, the Amrina B'Perek Tolen, we say in Masechet Shabbos and Perek Tolen, Ibatle Yehire, if we could get rid of the arrogant people amongst the Jewish people, if we could get rid of arrogant and corrupt people amongst the Jews, Badle Amgushi, then this would result in getting rid of the Persian fire priests. The Persians had a religion or a sect that worshipped fire, and the priests of this sect were known to be particularly harsh on the Jews, particularly severe, and particularly went out of their ways to persecute the Jews. But the Gemara is saying, if we got rid of our own corrupt and arrogant leaders and people, then that would result in us not having to suffer from these Persian priests of this sect. Ibadli Dayone, if we get rid of our corrupt judges, and the Gemara there talks about the terrible avera, the terrible situation that exists if your judges and your leaders are themselves corrupt. But if we could get rid of them, of the corrupt judges, batle gizir pate, then we could get rid of our harsh taskmasters, our harsh overseers of non-Jews who are oppressing us. So the point of that Gemara that the Zera Shimshon is bringing is to say that we always have to remember, if there's suffering in the world, it's connected to how the Jews are acting in some way. And specifically, if the Jews are being oppressed in various ways, that is definitely connected to how we're acting. And if we improve if we do tshuva and we improve and we deal with the problems in our Jewish society, that will free us from some of the bad things that we're suffering from the non-Jewish world. Ubi Yavamos, and in a Gemara in Masechta Yavamos, it says as follows: Gozru al habasar, the non-Jewish nation that oppressed the Jews at that time, made a decree against meat, meaning they outlawed shechita, and they said you can't slaughter kosher meat. So the Jews were suffering by not being able to have access to kosher meat, which, by the way, is something that is an event that has happened many times throughout Jewish history, including in modern times, where different nations and different countries have made decrees against outlawing shechita and causing great problems for the Jewish community. But the Gemara all the way back then says, when the non-Jewish nation made a decree against kosher meat, mipnei hamtanos, it was because the Jewish people were waiting too long to give the gifts of meat that they were supposed to give to the Kohanim. When you shechted an animal back at that time, you were supposed to give certain parts of the animal to Kohanim to eat. And because the Jews didn't do that or waited too long to do that, they suffered a decree against kosher shechita, which made all of the Jewish people have a hard time getting meat. Gozru al hamer chatzos, when a decree came out against the Jewish bathhouses that the Jews used to use and they were closed down. Why did that happen? Mipnei hatvila, because Jews weren't being careful about immersion in the mikvah, which is a central part of Jewish life, and taras hamishpacha, and family purity. If the Jews weren't careful about that, that's why their bathhouses were closed down. And when a non-Jewish power decide to exhume the dead bodies of Jews, meaning that they came along and they said, we want this land that you turned into a cemetery, and they dug up the Jewish dead, and they moved them out of that place so they could take over the land. Why did that happen? Why did such a terrible thing happen? Because the Jews at that time used to celebrate on the non-Jewish holidays and rejoice as well, and therefore they suffered this terrible penalty of having their cemeteries, the bodies in the cemeteries exhumed. This Gemara in its own right is very powerful, but it's truly fascinating to think about the fact that the three gezeras that it mentions, the 3 degrees that it talks about as happening so long ago, are things that have happened in modern times, and certainly very specifically happened during the Holocaust. The forbidding of kosher meat, the closing down of Jewish bathhouses, and the exhuming of digging up Jewish cemeteries, all of these things, and the destruction of Jewish cemeteries, all of these things are not just ancient events. They're events that happened throughout Jewish history in different places at different times, and happened as recently as the Holocaust. And the Gemara's point is that all of those things were directly tied to specific failings and specific shortcomings in the Jewish community. Va'afal pichein, and even so, this is true, meaning even so it's true that in every generation, the suffering of the Jews can take place and even be worsened because of the actions of the Jews themselves. HaKadosh Baruch Hu matzilenu miyadam, as the Haggadah told us, Hashem saves us from our enemies, shelo yichlu osanu, that they can never, ever be able to totally destroy us. Hashem's promise to Avram Avinu, all the way back at the Bris Bein Episarim, it continues to protect us and continues to mean that God will always protect us during our years in exile, and then, of course, ultimately bring us back from exile and return all the Jews to Eretz Yisrael. The Meher B'Yameinu, it should come as soon as it possibly can. Yashar koach to everyone for participating.